In 11.7 Part 1, we're going to talk about samples and surveys. We're going to learn how to identify sampling methods, and we're going to recognize something called bias in samples and surveys. So we've got a lot of definitions going on. So we're going to start with the word population, and a population is going to be all the members of a set, like the population of a state, or the population of a town, or the population of a school. A sample is a part of that population. When people do surveys, which you've probably taken many of, they don't necessarily survey everyone in a city or everyone in the state. They survey a certain a certain sample of that population. We have several different types of samples. Suppose you want to know what percent of all voters in your city favor a tax increase to pay for school improvements. It'd be too difficult to ask an opinion of every voter. Instead, you select a sample of the voters to estimate the percentage who favor the idea. You can find different types of samples by the methods used to select them. The first type of sampling method is called a convenience sample. Select any members of the population who are conveniently and readily available. For example, let's say you want to do a survey on how good the food is in the cafeteria, so you go stand outside the cafeteria to survey people. That's a convenience survey because you know people are going in and out of the cafeteria. A self-selected sample, you select only members of the population who volunteer for the sample. Very often, teachers get surveys in their email to fill out, and some teachers fill them out and some don't. That is a self-selected sample. A systematic sample, you order the population in some way and then you select from it at regular intervals. For example, let's say you put all the students in the school in alphabetical order and you chose every 20th student to survey. That would be called a systematic sample. A random sample is when all members of the population are equally likely to be chosen. This often happens when you use something like a random number generator. A lot of times people who do surveys use some sort of computer program to randomly select people rather than them selecting who they're going to survey. The problem we're going to run into when we do surveys is something called a bias. A bias is a systematic error introduced by the sampling method. Sometimes part of the population is being overrepresented or underrepresented. So let's do an example. A newspaper wants to find out what percent of the city population favors a property tax increase to raise money for local parks. What is the sampling method used for each situation? Does the sample method have a bias? Explain. So the first scenario is a newspaper article on the tax increase invites readers to call the paper and express their opinions. Well, since they invited readers to call the paper, that's going to be a self-selected sample. That means that the people volunteer to call in and express their opinions. However, the next question is, does this sampling method have bias? First of all, I'm going to tell you that almost every sampling method has some sort of bias. It depends on how strong that bias is, on whether or not it's a good method for sampling a population. So in this particular example, it might have a bias depending on who calls the newspaper. So some people may feel really strongly about raising money for the local parks, in which case they may overflood the calls. There may be a lot of people who say, oh, I'm not paying taxes for anything, and they may get all their friends and neighbors together and say, let's all call in and say we don't want to raise the taxes. So when you have to explain the bias, I'm not going to write this down because it's written in the book packet. However, please write in complete sentences. In B, it says a reporter interviews people leaving the city's largest park. Well, if the reporter's just standing there in front of the park, interviewing people about raising taxes for the park, this is going to be a convenience sample because they don't really have to go out anywhere to get the surveys. They don't have to wait for people to call in. They don't have to send out surveys and hope people send it back. They're just getting it right then and there. Is this going to have a bias? Absolutely, because the people who use the park all the time probably want there to be money in the fund in order to keep it beautiful and maintained. So they may be overrepresented as opposed to people who feel that maybe the taxes aren't being utilized correctly. In C, a survey service calls every 50th listing from the local phone book. This is called systematic because there is some sort of organization to how this was done. The phone book is in alphabetical order. If they're calling every 50th person, there's a system for how they're choosing their surveys. Now, like I said before, is there going to be a bias? Almost every sampling method will always have a bias. So a possible bias to this particular method is there could be a link between the people who are listed or not listed in the phone book and the people who pay property taxes. It's possible that the people who pay property taxes may not be listed in the phone book because, as you may or may not know, it is a choice to be listed or not listed in the phone book. One way to collect sample information is to do something called performing a study, and there are a couple study methods that are used. The first type of study method is called an observational study. You measure or observe members of a sample in such a way that they are not affected by the study. For example, Mrs. Mueller's psychology class will sometimes set up students in classrooms to observe what other students do or do not do in a classroom, and you may not know why they're there or what they're studying. So it really doesn't affect probably what you're doing. Or if you think about panels where they put people together to talk about an issue, and then they have that two-way glass, and there are people behind the glass observing you. You know they're there, but they're not. You can't see them watching you, so it doesn't necessarily affect the study. Another type of study method is called a controlled experiment. You divide the sample into two groups. You impose a treatment on one group, but not on the other control group. Then you compare the effect on the treated group to the control group. You may know this better as like drug studies, where they'll always do what's called the placebo group and the treatment group. And then they'll study the effects of each group as to whether a certain medicine is effective against certain illnesses. The last type is a survey. This is the one you're most familiar with because you've probably taken 1 million surveys. A survey is when you ask every member of the sample the same set of questions. So if I wanted to get a survey of my students and their opinion of a flipped classroom versus the traditional stand and deliver classroom, I would ask every single student the exact same questions. One thing we have to worry about when we're writing a survey is biased survey questions. Not all survey questions are well written. It's really hard to write a good survey question that's not going to be biased. But there are some major things to look for. One of them is combining two or more issues. For example, let's say somebody was doing a survey on how people felt President Obama's presidency had been, and they decided to put into the question something about Obamacare as well. So you're starting to combine several issues, or maybe the war in Afghanistan. You also include that in there. All of a sudden, you've got too many issues going on. You also don't want to use double negatives. This is something that you know from English class. Don't use double negatives. You don't want to use overlapping answer choices. You got to make sure that if you're going to give somebody, say, a multiple choice question, you don't want multiple answers that kind of mean the same thing, because then you're really leading them to an answer. That brings us to words that cause strong reactions. This is also known as a loaded question. Sometimes you can ask a question that people feel really strongly about, and it could be starting an argument rather than just getting a survey. The last one is suggesting that you want a particular answer, also known as a leading question. So, for example, if I said, "Don't you think Mrs. Friedlieb is the best math teacher ever?" Well, I'm kind of leading you to say yes. I mean, you may not say yes, but I'm leading you that way. So it's called a leading question. In our next problem, we're going to determine if each survey question is biased or not. Remember, I said earlier that almost anything can be considered biased. It's, you kind of have to analyze the question in order to figure out what the bias is. So, in problem A, do you think farmers should use poison to control insects on crops? Did you notice the word poison in there? This problem is a loaded question. The reason it's loaded is because you use the word poison. Nobody wants poison on their crops. You're loading that question. Let me write loaded question here. So, of course, it has bias. Instead of poison, they could have used the word pesticide. People understand what pesticides are. Pesticides are a poison, but there are pesticides that don't affect people the way other pesticides do. In B, don't you agree that most child care workers are underpaid? Well, they want you to agree with them using that phrase, "Don't you agree?" So this is actually a leading question. So of course it has bias. They want you to say, yeah, they're underpaid. It suggests that you want a certain answer, and that answer is that child care workers are underpaid. In C, do you think teachers should communicate frequently with students and parents about class grades? Well, there is a bias because the question asks about two issues, and those two issues are teachers communicating with students and teachers communicating with parents. These would need to be two separate questions. So I'm going to write here two issues. And again, those two issues are the communication with the students and the communication with the parents. Because maybe a student wants to be communicated with about their grades and not necessarily have their parents know right away when it's something that they can easily fix. So how do you tell whether a survey question is biased? Make sure you look for unclear wording, strong words, suggestive wording, and combined questions.